On behalf of the Herman Charles Bosman Literary Society, you are all so welcome. And I can't tell you how excited and pleased and thankful we are that you came all the way, all of you, to share today with us. And last night when our poets from Mafeking came, I just talk on the bed, on the top of my head, because this is who I am. When I'm very nervous, I can't stop talking.
It is a privilege to stand here in this space. And we all, Herman Charles Bosman at school was one of my first interests in literature. Mainly because he made me laugh. And when you're at school, you like laughing. You don't like serious stories. But later on, I started to realize that he's actually a very serious writer. He's not only a writer that makes you laugh about the farmers that forgot to go to work or whatever. My topic for today is called A Writer's First Calling, Choosing Your Own World. What I want to do with my speech is I want to contextualize the context in which writing today takes place. We are part of modern literature, which has now also become postmodern literature, but literature and the whole endeavor of literature changed when it became modern. Before literature became modern, which was around about 1850 in Europe, it had an entirely different function. It was the most important difference that happened in literature. In South Africa, because we are a far-flung place that develops later, in many ways, the first modern literature actually only started around about 1930. Before that, literature was not modern. Today in South Africa we have various forms of pre-modern literature and modern literature. Now anybody that wants to become a writer today, inevitably you're going to be part of the modern framework of literature. There's publication, there's the globalisation of the word. We are part of modern literature, even if you don't want to be, you have to be. And what makes South Africa quite special, and places like South Africa, maybe Chile, some other countries in Africa as well, we have a mix of the modern and the pre-modern shapes of literature. Like, for instance, a praise poet. The praise poet tradition is essentially a pre-modern tradition, and I will talk about that. But the written word in South Africa is part of the modern context of literature, and it has a very different thrust. With thrust, I mean why people write. Before the modern era, writers wanted to do other things than writers wanted to do today. I wrote an essay of this in an academic magazine called Litnet Academies, and it was called Roland Barthes and the significance of autonomy for the modern writer. I wrote it in Afrikaans, but there's a long abstract in English for those who are English, and they can go read it there. So my ideas about what modern literature is taken very strongly from the French literary philosopher Roland Barthes. What he said about what it means to be a modern writer. So I divided my speech into various sections. First, the introduction, which I've almost given you now. Then number 2, how is this search for how is this search for modern literature, which entails individual expression, best attained? Then number 3, globalism and the search for individualist creation. And number 4, I want to talk about mother tongue usage in literature. And number 5, about the world of translation. Translation in the modern context of literature is becoming more and more important by the day. It is a very, very sophisticated industry. It's a huge industry, translation. In South Africa and in Africa, it will become more and more important as the years go on. Because we have many languages on this continent, we have got no option but to either lose them or to translate them to one another. So, and of course to learn to speak them. But everybody doesn't speak, isn't inclined to speak many languages. So that's why translation will always be important. I know that the young kids of today, like my sister's children, they speak 4 languages. They come out of school and they speak 4 languages. And these children speak fluent Tswana, for instance. And many Tswana people are, because they learn it at school. Or they can choose to learn it at school. So the kids speak Afrikaans, English, Tswana, and Portuguese. That was their choice. And when you're a child, you learn languages much quicker. So we that grew up under apartheid, like me and others, on the whole, we speak only 1 or 2 languages, But that is set to change. And I'll now read from my script here. In my essay I've already told you that in South Africa, modern literature actually really only started in 1930. Just another aside, the Afrikaans poet and thinker N.P. van Wyk Louw wrote somewhere that up to 1920, the Afrikaner, the white Afrikaner, had the mentality of a late 17th century European. So that gives you an impression that how unmodern South Africa has been up to a very late stage. The white people of South Africa actually left Europe before modernity. They were pre-modern people when they came here, and stayed that for a very long time. So almost everybody in South Africa, black and white, have one thing in common. Modernity came to them at a very late stage. We have it in common. Okay, now I will go back to my speech. The basic modern thrust okay. In my essay on the literary philosopher Roland Barthes that I spoke about, that I referred to just now, I talk about what modern literature is, in my opinion. So you can go there and read it on the internet. And I talk about the threats that modern literature sometimes faces today. And I will draw on those ideas. The basic thrust of modern literature, and each one of us write modern literature, and what we will read just now, on the whole, is probably modern literature, which is mostly literature published today, is the quest for individualist utterance. Before modernity, before modern literature, the quest for individual utterance was very weak. It wasn't so upfront as today. With individualism, I mean expression or utterance that can be distinguished from all other expressions in its elegance, its content, and its effects that it wants to convey to the reader. One modern writer wants to always say something else than another modern writer. They don't want to say the same thing. Before modern literature, the quest for individualism was not of primary importance. Things that were important were meticulous observation and giving the correct description of reality or the truth. These things were considered fixed, and now you must describe it. But that was before the realization set in that reality is experienced by everybody, also in a subjective way. It is not something that is objective in all its respects. Some of the most important aspects of reality are subjectively constituted and experienced. Reality is not going to be the same for everyone. This realization opened the door for the multiplicity of literary expression that we find today, and the inexhaustible quest for new insights and new ways of saying old things. Because now the world is never old. It is as new as it gets to sound. There also exists different ways of looking, and these differ in important respects from individual to individual, from culture to culture, from language to language, like fingerprints do. We have fingerprints, so, and they differ. What we have in our mind and our heads are also like fingerprints, they also differ. A good example of a pre-modern type of literature is the praise poet tradition, as I've already said. It is not a tradition that hinges on new ways of saying, but on making the old way of saying more and more perfect. That is a different quest than we have with modern literature. It is no coincidence that in recent years there was a now ridiculed science must fall movement among students. This entailed a sudden, very modern realization among a particular generation that even science has a subjective component, that it has a narrative that can be told in more than one way, that this narrative might have a cultural aspect involved as well. Of course, the science must fall movement took the realization hopelessly too far, but there was still some kernel there of truth. There is, of course, objectivity in science. Now, some students did not believe this, but they will one day believe it. When the apple fell on Newton's head, I'm not sure if it fell on his head or in front of him, but it fell on everybody's head, not even the heads of those who are not born yet. So there is an objective part to science, but there's also a subjective part. And this is the part that creative writers are always interested in. What part is what part is subjective. It doesn't. It does seem that today, where we are today in the world, individual utterance is here to stay with a vengeance. Note carefully that the quest for individuality is in some respects at loggerheads even with the idea of social unity. Some ideas very strongly stressed in South Africa today, for good reasons very often. The idea of one person is all people, at loggerheads even with the idea of democracy to a certain extent. This quest, the individual literary quest, the individualism quest, which is so central to modern literature, is in some ways undemocratic and even antisocial. But I would describe it as an antisocial urge that wants to bring good to society. So modern writing, which is writing which wants to make new, can be described as an antisocial social act in many ways. If you go sit and you want to write a poem, very often you go away from the people and you go sit there and you go write your poem. That's already a sign that you are busy with something vertical inside of yourself, away from the people. Later on you will bring your poem and you'll read it to them. I'll go to number 2 now of my speech. Are you still awake, everybody? Yeah. How is this search for individual expression best attained? I want to return now to that phrase of mine, choosing your own world, in my title. I think the good writer looks for that which is specific, not that what is general. He wants to get to the general through that which is specific. That which is specific can teach one a lot about what is general, but he does so by searching and describing that which is particular or singular in a situation or a character. On the everyday level of choices that confront the writer, this search for the particular would translate into being able to recognize those things that are central or inherent in an environment or a situation or character or narrative dilemma. It is best to write about things in this quest for individuality that you personally, when you write, know about, that are close at hand for you, that you have some sort of relation to. Rather, as a South African, write about things that are South African, like, say, the breaking up of an extended family through urbanization, which is a very South African thing, rather than, say, write a Western. I would rephrase this and say, as a writer, identify with those things that can readily be identified with you. A Western cannot be readily identified with you as a South African writer. But for instance, the tension between a rural extended family and an urban nuclear family is a problematic that is typically South African, especially the culturally specific ways in which this dilemma sometimes happens. So, choosing one's own world can mean several things at the same time. It means choosing in favor of the worlds you are familiar with. It means choosing to look at these worlds in ways that are specific to you personally as a writer and the thing you want to describe or probe. And it means to express this in a way of your choice. The third thing is globalism. Now, we all know that we live in a world that is becoming rapidly globalized. This has a huge effect on the individualism quest of the writer, because the worlds around us are changing and becoming more like, they start looking like other worlds, like a world like South Africa is starting to look in many respects like America, you know. So what do you do in this quest for finding that which is yours and you know, in a world in which these things happen? It is not difficult to see that globalism, despite all its undeniable benefits and points of progress, is at loggerheads with the most basic norm of modern art, namely the search for individuality, originality, and the specific, the search for the specific. Globalism tends to promote general consensus and overlapping of appearances, and it tends to weaken a consciousness of points of difference. If you think about it carefully, this is exactly what modern art tries to do. There is, therefore, almost a natural conflict between the modern artist and globalism. If you are going to take your craft seriously as a modern artist, you have a natural enemy in globalism, a natural enemy. It's either the one or the other who's going to win. I want to go on now to, in this situation of a changing world, the significance of mother tongue usage in literature. Now, mother tongue usage is one of the ways in which one can make sure you reach the specific, that which is your world, as opposed to that which is the imposed world from outside, or the imitated world of other people. It is a very interesting topic, this thing of indigenous language as a vehicle for artistic expression. Now, I can understand, of course, in South Africa, we can all understand this, that the reason why people are writing today, many people are writing today in English as a second language, also in India, for instance, is because they can reach more people and make their specific world more understandable to more people. But there might also be a loss involved. To write in English in a multilingual country, more people will understand you, especially seen against a past in which peoples, and in this country, were cut up socially and divided by an unwelcome system. I personally sometimes write in English too, even though I write in Afrikaans at other times. So I try to balance the two, you know. I try to make sure that I don't lose my only link to the specific by writing in Afrikaans, but then I also write in English to make sure, and I sometimes translate myself to make sure that it gets to a wider audience, or some other people. I mean, I have some friends that cannot understand Afrikaans, and they, you know, and I've actually, that was one of the first reasons I tried to translate myself, so that my own personal friends could understand what I'm writing, you know. So it is a dilemma for us South Africans, this thing about indigenous language, or your own language, and English, which is a world language, and it is, and we have to admit to ourselves that having a world language at our disposal is a huge gift. We have a bigger gift than say, people living in Russia, who must learn English as a third language. You know, we can learn it as a second, or they must learn it even as a fifth language. We can learn it, it comes to us naturally. So it is a gift, but it is also a danger. Some other, I'll carry on now. However, some other time it might become necessary for South African writers to think about the possible gains of a local language for their art. I've already mentioned the synergy in the shapes of a language and its organic, the shapes of a language and its organic environment. There's a synergy between the shapes of languages and the environment that produce them. I sometimes think I can see the shapes of a language even in the trees of a particular place, but it might be my imagination, but I sometimes think I can see that. This means a local language would probably offer more deeply natural and fitting ways for a writer of a specific locality to express their reality in. This choice would also be in sync, entirely in sync, with a modern artistic striving for that which is particular and individual in expression. And this is why I believe the choice for local languages will become stronger in the years to come, simply because writers will realize that there are things that you can say in this language that you cannot say in the other one. But once you have said it, you can maybe translate it. But you cannot get there through the global language. You can only get there through your language. It is very interesting to note as a counterpoint, though, that South African English is also not the same as global English. It is changing. Herman Charles Bosman was one of the very first writers that proved to us that South African English is not the same as English. It already changed into something else. And the English here has acquired its own personality and its own shapes, and I would always want to say its own way of walking. The subconscious striving to make an expression new and different has already taken its toll on South African English. This is part and due to the fact that all different peoples use this language. There's a huge impact of Afrikaans, for instance, on South African English. There's a huge impact of in the English that I see my friend Bonani Bila writing of Tsitsonga on his English. It changes the shape of his English. The South African writer Imran Kuvadia wrote a book titled, a novel titled The Institute for Taxi Poetry. Now this is a very, very interesting idea, because we know taxi poetry is a very, very funny and strange thing. You know, the lines that you get on the buses, the taxi poets. It contains the strange shapes of local township English and the very particular notions of the poetic that can exist among taxi drivers. Now in this novel there's an institute where you learn taxi poetry, where you can, because it is a specific thing, this taxi poetry thing. If you don't understand it, it looks and sounds crazy or even stupid. But if you key into the plane of thought that is prevalent in these seemingly ungainly expressions, you notice a very particular connection of to the poetic, a poetic that exists nowhere else in the world except here in South Africa.
Can you give an example?
You know, I can't at this moment, but just before I wrote this, a friend of mine gave me a very nice example and I forgot it. But I mean, the examples abound. Maybe we can even go to town just now and look for one. My last point is in this essay that I wrote about the search for the individualist, and this also connects up with what Santa said earlier about, you know, you give of yourself, and the world of translation. I think older writers, even in the time of Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare was a very individualist writer in his time, and he is even today. But he was it almost by accident, because the ethic of writing that time was writing about something that is fixed and there. Whereas the ethic today, as I've already said, I'm just repeating it, is writing about something which is moving and which is not there, but it is in yourself. It's a very big shift. About translation, number 5. Nobody knows the particularities of languages better than translators. If you start translating simple sentences in a literary context from one language to another, as a simple exercise, you will already get an impression of how languages depict reality in their particular ways. I will take an example now of the 2 languages that I personally know the best, and I'll give you two rudimentary examples of this, and I will write it here on the blackboard. In Afrikaans there is a book of short stories titled Onwaarskynlike Engele. It is by Rachel Greef. Okay. Onwaarskynlike Engele in English means unlikely angels, but it's a very, it doesn't really say what that original writer. Right. Okay, I'm feeling very important now writing on the blackboard in Herman Charles Bosman's school. Yeah. Is it big enough?
Mm-hmm. It's too dark, we can't see that.
Yeah, but I'll show you. Put it in there. I must fit it in, damn it. That is.
You won't score very high for blackboard work, by the way.
Say again?
You don't score high for blackboard work.
Say again?
You don't score high for blackboard work.
Oh, I don't score high, yeah.
Yeah. 3%.
Oh, shucks.
Yeah. That's what I mean.
Okay. Here is yeah, I was once a teacher, but only for 3 weeks, and it was in the time of the student boycotts in 1968. I was 86. I was in university at that time, and for postgraduate whatever, and I wanted to make extra money, so I got this job, and just the next day they told me, don't come to work. So I actually literally only wrote on the blackboard once, and this is the second time. There is a phrase. Onwaarskynlike Engele. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, to translate this into English, you get something like this. Unlikely angels. But can you see? It does not come close to saying the same thing. Because in Afrikaans you have not only the meaning of the phrase, but the composite parts of the words are also contributing to the meaning. Like, for instance, waar, which means true, and skyn, which means shine, or false, or false. None of these meanings you get in the word unlikely angels. Maybe the translation unapparent angels would be a better one, but still, it is very difficult. Now, I was wondering, in fact, how this phrase would translate into Tswana. If they are the Tswana writers here that write actually actively in Tswana. Could you translate that for me? Could you translate that? Unlikely angels. Angels that are so completely accidentally angels that you can't believe it. Do you want to come write it? Or not? Somebody else wants to try? I'm just very interested in seeing if one can translate it into China. Can you come write it? I will keep this for you. Okay, maybe you can write it at the top. Yes, but this is not very interesting. This part is the same. Yeah. And what does dika mean? Unlikely. Does this dika mean other words as well? Except unlikely. Maybe. Sometimes words
they can have the same meaning. I mean different meanings, yeah.
Give me one more meaning.
Dika.
It's only one way.
Is it one way?
Give me one way in which you use this in an ordinary daily way. Okay. What I suspect is that
if you say it's street language, Hong Kong. It's not something right. Something real. Something that is not real.
I see.
Unreal.
Okay, so it has the meaning of unlikely and unreal. Yeah. So that in Tswana it is closer to the Afrikaans.
Onwaar. It's also onwaar.
Yeah. These are very simple examples of what translators battles with when they are busy translating entire sentences. I think I've got one more example. From a simple example like this, one can see some of the sense of writing in a local language there, because you are going to be able to say things that you cannot say in English. I think I've got I've got another example here. It is the title of no, it's the other way around. Afrikaans English. It's the title of a short story book by Raymond Carver. Do you know this American writer, Raymond Carver? He's a very good writer. If you like short stories, you can read him. He's very good. And the book's name was What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. And when I saw this title the first time, I loved it so much, because what you talk about when you talk about love, it sounds as if it shouldn't be a title, because it's so unwieldy, but it has got an elegance that is actually so beautiful. But now try and translate it into Afrikaans, then you get something terrible like waaroor ons praat as ons oor liefde praat. You can't do it. Several aspects get lost. Most notably, the staccato rhythm of the English, which seems to have the silent meaning in its sound application of stacking building blocks. You know, what we talk about when we talk about love.
You can wrap it. You can wrap it. What you talk about when you talk about love.
It is actually a very elegant arrangement of sounds.
Actually, the country,
Yes. So in another language, you will have to find an entirely different way of saying the same thing. I'm not saying that translation is impossible. I think translation is very, very possible. And it's very, very important, because I mean, we even translate ourselves to one another when we talk. When say when two people have an argument or whatever, you are translating two worlds to one another. You know, translation is is with us as human beings, as beings that can talk every moment of the day, and maybe even with other creatures, because I think they can talk as well. You know, like whales can talk, and there's some proof now that dogs are even talking to one another. They talk, you know, they say different things with different sounds. Especially cats talk, I know, because I have cats, they talk. I'm going to go on two more things, then I'm finished. As we know now, I was talking about the quest for individual expression as being the most important for the modern writer anywhere in the world, be they in Chile, be they in Kenya, be they in Australia, be they in South Africa. But the greatest danger, in my opinion, the greatest danger for the modern writer today is something called ideology. And ideology is everywhere in the world the weapon of politics. And it's a very, very successful and very dangerous weapon. Ideology is a way of approaching reality in which preconceived belief is more important than inquiry. All governments resort to ideology from time to time, and this is one reason, in my opinion, why being a good writer means never trust a government, even a good one. As a writer, you live on one planet. Whoever is the government lives on another planet. You know, if they want to come visit you, ask them for their visa. Governments are very good at demanding respect for themselves. As a writer, start from the get-go by being equally good at demanding respect for yourself as a writer, from whoever is in power. If you say to that person a meneer, you tell that person to tell you, because you're a writer, you're also a meneer. Okay? You perform an important enough function in this world to deserve the same respect. And now my conclusion. Choosing your own world is a good rule of thumb for a writer to attain integrity and elegance in their writing. And it can mean more than one thing. It is also the best way to attain ethical utterance, because it is the terms that are closest to you that you're writing to express what you think is good. And the chances of you acting up or pretending when you're writing in terms that are very well known to you and that are personal to you are at a minimum. By ethical utterance, I mean utterance that has an ethical implication to it, that wants to improve a situation or convey a deeper wisdom to other people around you and make their lives better and your own. Every writer must interpret this rule of thumb for themselves. They cannot be told by another writer how they must do this. And probably everyone's interpretation would in part be different from others. Choosing your own world as a writer is, in a nutshell, embodying your autonomy as a creative person. Thank you very much.